Now that President Biden has addressed the American people about the 4 objects that were recently shot down, for a moment, let's just assume that those objects are balloons or something else that's mundane. Now let's only focus on the government's response to this situation. According to DoD briefing cards that date back to 2020, the government has repeatedly stated that
we take reports of incursions into our airspace by any aircraft, identified or unidentified, very seriously and investigate each one.
But as more historical information associated with objects being tracked in our airspace comes to light, it appears that someone or some organization within the DoD decided that the rest of the government doesn't need to be made aware of them, including the Oval Office, as well as we the people. But what's done in the dark will always come to the light. And how the DoD responds to these 4 prosaic objects that are just the last 4 in a series of hundreds of similar reports is inadvertently shedding a match's worth of light on the decades-long imposed darkness that has shrouded the UFO phenomenon. So will you and our elected officials allow the DoD to extinguish this brief moment of illumination? Or will you support those that have been pushing to bring this issue to light? So, in a weird way, UFOs are indirectly the cause of and cure for the recently identified domain awareness gap that the Chinese spy balloon has brought to the world's attention. Because for decades, the targeted stigma around UFOs has resulted in pilots being unwilling to report unusual objects that they see in our skies, both the mundane and the anomalous. Combined with the intentional filtering out of unknowns at our nation's most advanced radar and sensor stations, this has caused a substantial national security blind spot. But thanks to the efforts of Chris Mellon, Marco Rubio, Kirsten Gillibrand, and many others, we have possibly just witnessed the beginning of the end of this blind spot, which is in part due to the reduction of stigma that surrounds these anomalous phenomena in our airspace. And don't forget that closing the domain awareness gap is just a byproduct of a much greater effort. An effort that has resulted in 33 pages of UAP-related legislation being included in the recently passed National Defense Authorization Act. Efforts that fought for the establishment and continued support of a congressionally overseen UAP investigation office. This office, known as ARROW, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and they have been strategically set up to give them the best chance to succeed. So it is concerning to me that the government has recently responded in what appears to be a knee-jerk reaction to these recent events by announcing the creation of an interagency team to study unidentified aerial objects, a team that is headed up by the President's National Security Advisor and includes the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence. But this team is missing Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who heads up the ARROW effort, or who the ARROW office reports to, which includes the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. If this isn't a case of the government going over the heads of our elected officials, then I don't know what is. The optimist in me hopes that the members of this interagency team are going to immediately throw their weight and support behind the broad-ranging efforts of the ARROW office. But the pessimist in me fears that they're going to override ARROW and congressional oversight and reduce the scope of their efforts to only focus on the new known threats that are in our airspace, instead of opening their aperture even further in an effort to learn more about the knowns and unknowns in our skies, seas, and space. While you're thinking about those unknowns, also think about the level of transparency we're receiving about balloons. Now think about the levels that that very same government would go to if they learned about something on our planet that was truly anomalous. Would they be willing to keep the American people in the dark and treat them like children for 78 plus years? That's exactly one of the questions that the 33 pages of UAP-related legislation in the NDAA seeks to answer. Because it requires ARROW to investigate the government's involvement with UFOs dating back to 1945. So what could this investigation uncover? Maybe they'll learn why the Air Force is AWOL on the UAP issue, as Chris Mellon has stated. In this piece published in February of 2022, he lays out the case that the Air Force has both a massive air and space surveillance capability, as well as a pattern of contempt for civilian oversight. A pattern that is brought into sharp focus when you compare the Navy's willingness to participate on the UAP topic, in contrast to the Air Force's almost complete absence. It should be noted that all of the 144 UAP reports included in the preliminary assessment are rumored to have come solely from the Navy. It should also be noted that the Navy and Air Force use similar sensor systems and monitor similar regions. To further add to the Air Force's apparent unwillingness to engage on this topic, and based on statements recently communicated by Ross Coulthard on Need to Know, what if the Navy has recently learned of some of the Air Force's actions? That indicates that the Air Force has been concealing certain knowledge and insight about a subject that could have global implications for all of humanity. Would that provide the justification needed to override an established and congressionally mandated office and elevate the UAP issue to the highest levels of the government? Unfortunately, only time will tell. But until then, keep an eye on how they respond to you about 4 balloons.